This is the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusive ScottishVisits.co.uk.
Hello, this is John Robert Mackay Harbour, and welcome to Unique Scotland, the podcast from my website exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk, which gives you an insight into the real Scotland, its people, its customs, its traditions, the amazing castles and palaces, battlefields, the incredible landscapes of mountains and glens, and the deep freshwater lochs such as Loch Ness and Loch Lomond. My intention is to take you on a journey, sharing with you all that Scotland has to offer. Your future tours of Scotland may be shaped by some of what you discover here, or if you can't come to Scotland in person, then I hope that by listening to this and my other podcasts, as well as viewing my monthly video podcast, you can let your imagination wander and be part of the virtual tours that we take around this magical land. This podcast is the first in a tour trilogy that will take us from Loch Ness to the Island of Skye, and a tour of the Misty Isle. In my last episode, we travelled from Inverness to Edinburgh, and, on passing Loch Ness, we saw the turning to Skye from Glen Moriston. Well, today, as we leave Loch Ness, we will take that turning and head up Glen Moriston, past Loch Cluny, then on to Glen Shiel, and I'll touch upon the Battle of Glen Shiel of 1719. From there, we'll call into the most photographed castle in Scotland, Eilean Donan, before popping into the wonderful gardens at Attadale on the shores of Loch Carron. Then we'll cross the Skye Bridge onto the Island of Skye, or the Misty Isle as it's known. And as we cross, I'll tell you how a Norwegian Princess used to reward passing ships who paid their toll fee and how she became known as Saucy Mary. Skye is one of the most popular islands to visit in Scotland, and I'm excited to be telling you all about it. It's going to be a wonderful trip, so I'd now like you to relax, wherever you are, and enjoy your Unique Scotland tour from Loch Ness to Skye. If you're at home and enjoying a wee dram, then I raise my glass to you with the traditional Gaelic Scottish toast, Slán Jabhar. Well, we've just turned right onto Glen Moriston, and on the right-hand side as we turn is the Glen Moriston Arms Hotel, a place I often stop for a bite of lunch on my journeys around this area. The staff are always friendly and the food is good. Well, after lunch and before we head west, there's a lovely walk alongside the River Moriston, to a set of rapids or falls as it's called. The village of Moriston takes its name from the river, as the word Inver means at the mouth of. So Moriston is at the mouth of the River Moriston. It's just the same as Inverness, the city at the mouth of the River Ness. Well, as we walk along the path, we follow the river as it snakes its way towards the loch. And as it's been raining recently, the river is in spate, and the noise of it thundering through the narrow passage down from the bridge makes it quite spectacular. If you continue up the river bank, you come to a stone summer house, and that's owned by Historic Scotland. And you can sit there a while and watch the river and the world go by. There's also two stone-built bridges, the first of which is a 2-lane bridge for cars and runs through the village of Moriston, and the second is a stone-built single-track bridge dating from about 1813, and it used to be the main road from Drambuie to Fort Augustus. The great thing about this bridge is that it was designed and built by Thomas Telford, and that's the man I mentioned in my last podcast who engineered the building of the Caledonia Canal. Well, after our break, we get back on the road, heading west, along Glen Moriston until we arrive at Loch Cluny, at the southeastern edge of Glen Shiel. This Loch Cluny is actually a reservoir, contained behind the Cluny Dam, which was built in 1957 as part of a hydroelectric scheme. Now, I've mentioned in previous podcasts how Scotland is rich in natural energy, wind being one of them, and the force of nature that ripped the door off my car when I was visiting relatives in the far north of Scotland. Well, It will come as no surprise, I'm sure, that water is also a source of natural energy which is harnessed all over Scotland. Renewable energy is a hugely important issue all over the world, and it's been embraced in Scotland with all the natural resources on tap, if you'll excuse the pun. Water power has for many years been the main source of that power in Scotland, but wind power is contributing greatly to the renewable energy revolution. The renewable sector is 3 times bigger than it was in 2009, and onshore wind now accounts for 70% of installed capacity. It's quite extraordinary, and it's growing all the time. As we pass Loch Cluny, we enter Glen Shiel, and the further west we go, the glen narrows with the mountains closing in until they seem to be towering over the top of us. And if you look over to the right, you will see a range of mountains of 5 peaks, known as the 5 Sisters of Kintail, and they rise up from Glen Shiel. The highest about 3,500 feet, which is just over 1,000 metres, and according to one of the many legends, these 5 sisters are the oldest of 7, but the 2 younger sisters fell in love with Irish princes and went off with their lovers. The princes promised to send their 5 brothers back to marry those left behind, so the sisters waited, eventually turning into mountains of stone to maintain their vigil into eternity. As we drive along the road towards Skye, we will see a sign with crossed swords at the side of the road. These crossed swords indicate the site of a historic battle, and this one is particularly well known as it was fought during the Jacobite Rebellion in 1719. Strangely enough, it involved some Spaniards fighting alongside Jacobite troops, the Mackenzies and the Macraes. As it happened, Spain had been at war with Britain for about a year, and was only too happy to help the Jacobite cause in unseating the Protestant king. Anyway, about 300 Spaniards had landed at Eilean Donan Castle, which we'll be actually seeing shortly, and joined a Jacobite force of about 1,000 men. They eventually dug in at this particular point in Glen Shiel, which is the narrow part of the glen, and were attacked by a British force that had come up Glen Moriston. The British won the day, and the 1719 uprising was put down. Most of the Spanish were captured and imprisoned in Edinburgh Castle, a place you must visit when you come to Scotland. The prisons themselves are fascinating, and I strongly recommend you get down to see them. Anyway, the Spaniards were eventually released back to Spain as ex-prisoners of war. If you wanted to stop at this point along the road, there is a lay-by at the side of the road and some signs explaining the battle and its outcome. And one of the mountains nearby is now known as Spanish Mountain, as a memorial to the Spaniards who took part in the battle. Well, as we continue on, there is a sharp bend to the right, and Loch Duick comes into view on the left-hand side. Now keep an eye out for wild goats who have made the Kintail Mountains their home. These goats, and there's about 100 of them, are from ancient herds and believed to have been in Scotland for between 4,000 and 5,000 years. There's about 3,000 altogether in Scotland, and although they probably originate from the Middle East, they have acclimatised well and seem to thrive in the mountains in Scotland. We continue along Loch Duick, and then, the moment we have been waiting for, Eilean Donan Castle, the most photographed castle in Scotland, comes into sight straight ahead. It seems to be floating on the water, and is indeed sitting on a small island with a land bridge joining it to the shore. The word Eilean in Gaelic means island, and Donan refers to Saint Donan, a 6th or 7th century Irish priest who evangelised on the west coast of Scotland, and is believed to have had a cell on the island. The castle itself was originally built in the 13th century for the Mackenzie clan, and the Macrae clan became the bodyguard to the Mackenzie chiefs, thus the Macrae connection. Now, I am not keen on using the word iconic, but when you see Eilean Donan for the first time, it is probably one of the most iconic images of Scotland, and you're bound to have seen it in a photo at some time or other. It sits out on its own island, surrounded by 3 sea lochs, Loch Alsh, Loch Duick and Loch Long, among some of the most amazing scenery, and it is little wonder that it is one of the most visited attractions in Scotland. As we turn into the car park ahead of us, we can see the island, with the castle standing proud above the surrounding lochs, and a 3-arched stone bridge that joins the rocky shore with the mainland. As we look at it, right at the front, there is a curved wall jutting out from some stone buildings, and this is a bastion, with the main water well behind it. Off to the right is the main tower house, or keep, 5 stories high, and off to the left, at 3 stories high, is another wing of the castle that would have been a storage area in the past. Well, once we've parked and get out of the car, it's breathtaking just to stand by the side of the loch and take in the castle view. However, not everything is as it would seem. There's something odd about the castle, and when visiting with guests, the first thing I point out is the colour of stone at the top of the buildings is slightly lighter than the stone at the bottom, and there's a reason for this. The foundations and lower walls of the castle are probably from the 13th century, but everything above dates from the 20th century. Now I can imagine you thinking, how can a 20th century building gain iconic status? Well, the secret is that it's a rebuild, which was a labour of love to bring the original ruined castle back to life. And the reason for the need to rebuild was due to a battle fought in 1719, with a direct connection to the Battle of Glen Shiel that I just mentioned earlier. There was a garrison of Spanish soldiers living in the castle, and when the British government sent a regiment of soldiers up to the area to deal with the Jacobites and their sympathisers in Glen Shiel, they also sent up 3 frigates to bombard the castle: HMS Worcester, Enterprise and Flamborough. After a day of pounding the castle walls, the garrison fled, and Captain Herdman of HMS Enterprise came ashore to take the surrender. Most had fled, but all the gunpowder they had stored for their support of the Jacobites was still in place. So, with his order to destroy the castle, the gunpowder was placed in suitable areas around the castle and ignited to destroy the buildings, to ensure that it could no longer be used in the Jacobite cause. The Spaniards who had escaped, well, as we know, they met their fate at Glen Shiel. The rebuild, and it was almost a total rebuild, was carried out by Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae Gilstrap and Farquhar McCrae, his skilled clerk of works, between 1912 and 1932. It took 20 years. And it was a real labour of love, and inside you can get a glimpse of what a 13th century tower house would have looked like, with the ground floor entry with its barrel vaulted ceiling, probably a storeroom of the past, and the great hall above, now used as a banqueting hall. Bedrooms are on the upper floors, and it's a must visit, so I do hope that you have the opportunity to call this way in the future. On leaving the castle, we continue west, but before we head for the bridge to Skye, we will turn right and head up to a wonderful part of the Highlands towards Loch Carron. Initially, there's a considerable climb to get across the mountain to the loch, and then just before descending, there's a lay-by on the left-hand side, which provides a great vantage point, where on a clear day you can get a fabulous view across the loch and the towering Torridon Mountains in the distance. And then if you look further west, you get a terrific view of the Cullen Mountains of Skye, which we will be driving through later on. Our destination now is Attadale Gardens, run by Lady Laird Joanna Macpherson and her husband Alec. Attadale is long established, comprising a woodland garden of about 20 acres. It was started in the late 19th century by the Schroders, a German banking family, who rented the house from the Mathesons, who were the controlling clan in this part of the world up to the 19th century. So what we'll see today is a well-established tree and historic rhododendron collection, and a beautiful collection of flowers and shrubs, and also representative gardens such as Nepal and Japan. And the plants do so well because of the influence of the Gulf Stream, mentioned in a previous podcast, that flows up from the warmer Atlantic Ocean. The effect is quite stark, and I mean by that, Attadale is on the same latitude as Moscow, but whereas Moscow freezes and can plunge to temperatures of minus 40 degrees Celsius, in Loch Carron it seldom drops below 0. At the centre of the garden is a lovely turreted white house, some parts of which date from the late 18th century. And from the front door you walk out onto a gravel path down towards a lovely sunken fern garden and a Japanese garden beyond. The thing that will surprise you as you walk around are the number of magnificent sculptures, sometimes hidden within the foliage of some exotic plant or shrub. And I'm going to stop there, as I'll be covering more of this garden on my podcast on Gardens of Scotland, and I'm delighted to say that Joanne Macpherson will join us on that day to give us a personal view explaining more of this wonderful space. As we leave Attadale, it's worth noting that the railway line runs close by. But more interesting is that there is a small platform to join and leave trains here, and it is one of the few request stops in the United Kingdom, allowing visitors and tourists to arrive by train to visit the gardens. To get off, you simply ask the guard to stop the train, and to get on to a passing train, just stick out your hand and the driver will stop. Brilliant. Well, we head back along the road, returning the way we came, and when we meet the main road again, we turn right towards the town of Isle of Skye. It only takes about 10 minutes to get to the town, and we'll have to pass through it to cross the bridge to Skye. A Kyle is a narrow channel or strait, and the Kyle in this instance is the body of water that runs between the Isle of Skye and the opposite bank on the Isle of Skye called Kyle Lacan. A ferry used to connect the two towns, but this was replaced by the bridge when it opened in 1995. Isle of Skye town is now a transport and shopping centre, and has a small harbour and marina with a berth for small visiting ships. The train station is near the pier, and today provides a service to Inverness. The station was opened in 1897, and until the 1970s provided a connection from the mainland to Stornoway in the Outer Hebrides. Isle of Skye is not a large town with under 1,000 inhabitants, and tourism really is the main source of income. Well, after a cup of tea at a local cafe, the excitement mounts as we get back into the car and head towards the bridge. That will take us on to the island of Skye. Now, the bridge was only opened in 1995, and it's beautiful, almost majestic, with a large arched back to allow sizable ships to pass underneath. But its history is mired in a scandal, and it's alleged that a bridge that should not have cost more than 25 million ended up costing about 93 million pounds. It's a long story revolving around the first major capital project funded by a private finance initiative, and one you may wish to investigate further. But the real story that I want to tell you about is the struggle the islanders had in battling what they thought was the exorbitant cost of using the bridge. Because the building costs had been carried by the contractor, that same contractor was granted a licence to operate the bridge and set the toll charge. Now, this toll charge for crossing the new bridge was £11.50 for a return journey, and that actually worked out at more than 14 times that of other bridges in Scotland. Well, as you can imagine, the locals and islanders were infuriated, and they rebelled. It was a bit farcical at times, with islanders arriving at the toll booths and refusing to pay the toll, then continuing to cross the bridge. Of course, their car number plates were taken and given to the police. In the end, 500 people were arrested for failing to pay the toll. 130 were subsequently convicted of non-payment, and one man, the Skye Against Tolls leader, Andy Anderson, was briefly jailed. The whole sorry saga ended in 2004, almost 10 years after the bridge opening, with the tolls being abolished, but not without much acrimony and sadness about the way this whole thing had been handled. Well, we are now on the bridge, and the views are spectacular. To the right, the stretch of water called the Inner Sound, and the small islands of Pabay and Scalpay close by. The island of Rassay is also visible just beyond them, and we'll see that later on our tour around the island. On the left and down below the bridge is the village of Kylacan, or the Strait of Haakon. It's named after King Haakon IV of Norway, whose fleet moored here in the 13th century before the final battle with the Scottish king that saw Haakon defeated and the Western Isles removed from Viking rule and returned to Scotland's control. Just beyond the town, in the distance, you should be able to see a ruined castle, Castle Moyle, sitting right on the water's edge. Now, I've talked about tolls. Well, it's known that tolls were being charged back in the 15th century, because legend has it that a Norwegian princess from Castle Moyle would charge any boat using the narrow channel a toll to pass. Once the toll had been paid, and the ship made its way through the channel, it's said that Princess Mary would appear on the castle parapet and show her breasts to the passing sailors, for which she was given the name Saucy Mary. Well, today one can still find bars and hotels in Kylacan bearing the name of Saucy Mary. And then we arrive onto the island of Skye, the Misty Isle or the Winged Isle. The origins of the name are truly lost in the mists of time. There are suggestions that it was the Romans who, on approaching the island for the first time, saw it covered in mist and gave it the name, the Misty Isle. The Norse word for mist is considered to be a possible explanation as well, but the Gaelic word could apparently be translated in a similar manner. On the other hand, the interpretation for the name Winged Isle simply comes from the shape of the island, and if you look at a map, you'll see the body of the island to the south, and the two peninsulas, the Waternish and Trotternish peninsulas, to the north, and they seem to protrude in a winged-like fashion. Personally, I think the island looks like the shape of a lobster, but that's just a personal opinion. Anyway, whatever the derivation, the island of Skye has become synonymous with beauty, mystery, and historical intrigue. So before we continue the tour, just a little bit about the island itself. The Isle of Skye is the largest of the islands in the Inner Hebrides, which are the set of islands that sit close to the Scottish mainland. The Outer Hebrides lie west of these islands, and we'll visit those in a later podcast. Further west and beyond the Outer Hebrides, there's an even remoter island group called St Kilda, and these were evacuated in the 1930s, as life for the small community became unsustainable. St Kilda has an intriguing history of its own, and more of that to come. Back to Skye. It's 60 miles long and covers an area of almost 650 square miles, or just over 1,600 square kilometres, with a population of about 10,000 people. The whole island seems to radiate from a mountainous centre, dominated by the Cuillin Mountains, and we will be passing through those mountains on our journey and experiencing some of the most dramatic mountain scenery in Scotland. The main industries are agriculture, fishing, forestry, and of course tourism. There's two main towns on the island, Broadford, that we'll see shortly, and the capital Portree, which we will visit later on. Out of the 10,000 population, about 2,500 live in Portree and 1,500 in Broadford, with the rest of the population living in crofting townships or settlements, mainly along the coastline. Well, now to continue the tour. As we come off the bridge, we turn right, heading north, and parallel the sea on our right-hand side. It's not long before we arrive at Broadford and the surrounding settlements, one of which has the strange name of Waterloo, which is unlike most of the other villages named in either Gaelic or Norse. Waterloo settlement got its name when it was established after the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 to house veterans of that war. It's got a lovely beach and it's a great place to find fossils. We enter Broadford, and in the summer months there'd be usually a huge bustle of shoppers around the supermarket that serves the area and the island. Cars with foreign number plates, caravanettes, bikers and hikers all congregate here before setting off to visit the island, or before leaving it, perhaps taking in the local galleries and tourist shops for that final purchase before heading for the bridge or the ferry. As we continue through the village, the lovely Broadford Hotel, which was established in 1611, is on the left-hand side. It's a 4-star hotel and has great views over Broadford Bay, but the reason for mentioning it is that it's the birthplace of the Scottish whisky liqueur Drambuie, and for those that do not know what it is, it's a sweet, golden-coloured liqueur made from Scotch whisky, honey, herbs and spices, but the actual recipe is a closely guarded secret locked away in some bank vault. I mentioned in my previous podcast that I'd be talking about Bonnie Prince Charlie, the leader of the Jacobites in Scotland, and Drambuie is the first link that I'd like to mention. After his devastating defeat at Culloden in 1746, he fled to the Isle of Skye, hiding from the British army who were hunting for him and had placed a huge bounty on his head. A few individuals helped him along the way, and it's reputed that he was given sanctuary by a Captain John Mackinnon who lived locally. After staying with him, the prince rewarded Mackinnon with the prize recipe for a liqueur. Now, there was no name to the recipe at the time, but it appears that Mackinnon gave or sold the recipe to John Ross, whose son James Ross ran the Broadford Hotel. Apparently, James experimented with the recipe and Drambuie was born. And I'll share with you another good recipe, and that's a drink called a rusty nail, which is 1 tot of Drambuie and 1 tot of malt whisky. And this is the one time that you can add ice to a single malt whisky, and forgive me to all those malt whisky connoisseurs who may be listening. So with the sea on our right and the mountains to our left, we leave Broadford and head to the north and the two peninsulas that make up the top of the island, the Waternish and Trotternish peninsulas. The mountains on the left are called the Red Hills due to the red granite composition. The highest mountain we are passing is a very steep ascent and is called Ben na Caoillich, or Mountain of the Old Woman, and there's a fascinating story behind this name. You'll recall Saucy Mary, the Norwegian princess who displayed her breasts to passing sailors in Eilean Strait. Well, the top of the mountain is reputedly where she lies at rest. There's an extremely old cairn, or pile of stones, at the summit, and that's meant to mark the grave of this Norwegian princess, whose dying wish was to be buried there so she could be high enough on Skye to feel the winds blowing over from Norway. As we continue north, just off to the right-hand side we can see the small island of Skye, which is just under 10 square miles. In the 19th century, islands of this size would provide for a community of about 100, but today they're managed by around 4 people, if they're occupied at all. Skye is privately owned and has a red deer farm, shooting estate and holiday cottage. There is some forestry, mainly conifer, but most of the island is covered in heather and turns a deep purple colour in July, August and September. Skye is a very indented coastline, and we soon reach Loch Carron and turn sharp left to go around the large sea loch. On the turn, there's a beautifully restored crofter's cottage with thatch roof and stones hanging down at the eaves, connected by rope to stones on the opposite side of the roof, just to make sure the wind doesn't get under the eaves and take the roof off. Well, we continue along the road, and at the head of the loch, just as we are about to turn right and head north once more, a fabulous waterfall opens up on the left-hand side, tumbling down from the mountains above us. I've got to warn guests of its approach, because we are soon past it, and we start to climb a steep hill into the Red Cullen Mountains. And as we start to reach the summit, look down to your right as we climb. You get a superb view of the shimmering Loch Carron below. After about 5 minutes, we start to drop down out of the high pass, out of the mountains, towards the next sea loch, Loch Sligacan, where we pass through the village of Sconser, and there's a small Caledonian McBrain Island ferry sitting alongside the pier. We skirt around the loch to take us down to a junction where we'll find the Sligacan Hotel, and one of the best viewpoints to catch both the Red and the Black Cullen Mountains together. I just have to mention this Loch Sligacan because this is the first place, about 5 years ago, where I saw my first osprey fishing on the loch. It was an extraordinary sight, and through my binoculars I was able to watch it descend to the surface of the water, talons extended, and grab a sizable fish, before taking off again with the fish struggling in its claws. It was particularly exciting for me because my logo on the front of this podcast and also on my website is the osprey, which I look upon as a guest or tourist who visits us in the summer months before heading off again in the winter to warmer climes. We soon arrive at the Sligacan Hotel, which was built in the 1830s and became a mecca for gentlemen climbers who recognised the extreme challenges that the Cullen Mountains offered. It's an excellent location and perfect for mountaineers, walkers and the thousands of tourists who flock to the island every year, who themselves just want to experience the wild mountain scenery and the great outdoors. Now, whereas the hotel has a more formal dining experience, at the back of the hotel is Seamus's Bar, a large barn-like space which is frequented by the many climbers, walkers and holidaymakers in the area. There's a great range of food and the welcome is warm. We'll certainly stop there for a coffee and a cake, but the real treat of the stop is the old stone archway bridge just across from the hotel that fords the river Sligacan, and from this viewpoint is a superb view of the Red Cullens to the east and the Black Cullens to the south. The colour of the mountains is determined by the rock formation, and in the case of the Red Cullens, they're mainly composed of red granite, and these are more rounded hills, weathered to the present shapes over the millennia. The one closest to us is called Glamig, and more of that one shortly. The Black Cullen are mainly composed of basalt and gabbro. Basalt is a dark-coloured, fine-grained igneous rock and commonly forms when extruding or pouring out from a volcano as lava flow, which then cools and hardens. Gabbro is an intrusive rock, which means it does not flow and remains beneath the land's surface. Then it cools into a hard, coarse mass. In effect, both basalt and gabbro are similar, and on cooling form the dark rock type which gives the Black Cuillin their name. Now, I'm no mountaineer or rock climber, but some friends who are tell me that the Cuillin Ridge provides some of the most dramatic and challenging mountain terrain in Scotland, and contains one of the longest rock climbs in Britain. Well, I have to say, the view from the stone bridge is spectacular, but I think I'll leave climbing these mountains to others better qualified. I want to come back to Glamig, the rounded red granite Cuillin, not far from where we're standing on the ancient stone bridge with the river Sligaken flowing underneath. There's a lovely story about Glamig of a young man who climbed to the top and back again in a record time that took over 100 years to beat. Glamig is just over 2,500 feet, so not an easy task. Anyway, in 1889, a Gurkha officer, Major Charles Bruce, was visiting Sligaken with the intention of climbing in the Black Cuillins. With him was an assistant, Rifleman Harkabir Thapa, a member of the Gurkha regiment. Now, Gurkhas are soldiers native to the Kingdom of Nepal, recruited by the British Army, after the British saw how effective they were during the Anglo-Nepalese War of 1814-16. They're still employed today and form a much respected army unit that's greatly contributed to the British Army. I believe it was a former Indian Chief of Staff who was reputed to have said that if a man says he's not afraid of dying, he's either lying or he's a Gurkha. Coming back to Glamig Mountain, the Major told Harkabir to see how long it would take to climb to the top and return. So he set off at pace, running to the summit and back, taking 1 hour 15 minutes. When it was later reported to the local laird, MacLeod of MacLeod, he refused point blank to believe it. He said that it was impossible, that this 4-mile course with a bog and steep grass ascent, with scree or loose stones on the mountainside, could be undertaken in such a short time, especially as the young man had ran barefooted. So Harkabir was asked to repeat the ascent, and this time he completed the course in 55 minutes, cutting a full 20 minutes off his first attempt. In honour of this feat, a Glamig race was initiated in the 1980s, and people from all over come to Skye every year to take part. It was not, however, until 1997, over 100 years later, until Harkabir's record was broken. The nice end to Harkabir's story, who served in the British Army for many more years, is that he survived the Battle of Gallipoli and also the First World War, retiring in a senior position and enjoying a good old age. Well, back in the present, if we walk across the bridge, away from the hotel, there's a gate leading onto a footpath that will take you on an amazing walk through the towering mountains to the other side of Skye to Loch Brittle. It's quite a trek, so you'd have to consult the right maps before considering this moderate walk. You would also be passing the famous fairy pools, but more of that later. Anyway, it's now time to leave Sligaken, so we return to the car and head north towards Portree, the second of the larger towns on Skye, and the one considered to be the capital. It's only about 10 miles of fairly straight road, but on leaving Sligaken behind, there's the steep hill to climb, and if one looks back on the right-hand side, the reward for being at such a height is the wonderful view down Loch Sligaken. To the right of us, on the road up to Portree, is the island of Rassay, sitting a couple of miles offshore. It's inhabited with about 180 people, and there's work from fishing and crofting and tourism, with a connecting ferry to Sconsor that we passed earlier. The island's about 14 miles long, north to south, and 3 miles wide. It has some great walks, and a day's hiking is highly recommended. There is a story of Rassay that I mentioned in a previous podcast. I was actually talking about the fortitude of the Scots and recounting the story of a man named Callum MacLeod, who lived at the northern end of Rassay, where there was only a dirt track road connecting his settlement with the main road to the south. He and the local villagers had tried for years to get the authorities to build a connecting road, but all the requests had fallen on deaf ears. Well, I'd like to quote from Roger Hutchison's book, actually called Callum's Road, how Callum took matters into his own hands and did something about it. One spring morning he set off with a pick, a shovel and a wheelbarrow, and alone in an empty landscape began with his bare hands a romantic, quixotic venture that would dominate the last 20 years of his life. Callum's Road would become a powerful and beautiful symbol of one man's defiance against the erosion of his native culture. Great book, great story. Well, we finally arrive in Portree, the capital of Skye. And as always in the summer, it's awash with tourists from all over the world, and they bring a buzz to this small town. Well, having reached our destination, and after a long day, we'll remain in Portree overnight. There's a couple of B&Bs I like to stay, and as long as they're not booked up already, I usually choose either Springfield, Greenacres or Rosebank B&Bs. My favourite hotel is the Coolin Hills Hotel, sitting high up on the cliffs above the harbour, with beautiful views across Portree Bay. And with that I retire gracefully to relax for the evening and book a table at my favourite seafood restaurant. Tomorrow we'll have a look around Portree, then we'll continue our tour and head north around one of the peninsulas, the Trotternish Ridge. And as we drive north, on the right-hand side you'll still be able to see the mainland of Scotland across the Rassay Sound. But once we come over the top and head south again, and if the weather is clear, we'll be able to see the Outer Hebrides and the Atlantic Ocean. On that drive we'll experience the amazing scenery, pass over a road that has to be repaired every year as the land is still moving so much, hear wonderful stories of times past, and visit the sites such as the Old Man of Storr, Kilt Rock, Flora MacDonald's resting place, Skye's Museum of Island Life and much more. Well, I hope you're continuing to enjoy your first part of the Skye trilogy on your unique Scotland journey. And if you wish to receive information on special podcasts, such as interviews or specific subjects requested by you, my listeners, then please sign up to the Keep in Touch section on my website at exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. I very much look forward to you joining me on next week's tour as we continue our wonderful journey around the Isle of Skye. And wherever you are in the world, listening to this podcast on a tour around Scotland, stay well and stay safe. And I raise my glass to you. Slanjava.
You've been listening to the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. To receive all our episodes automatically, please subscribe now.